What if I told you the greatest economic threat to the West didn't arrive with armies, bombs, or even political speeches, but inside cardboard boxes labeled, Made in China? What if the single biggest weapon transforming global power isn't military, technological, or even ideological, but price tags? Because behind every $3 phone charger, every $10 hoodie, every $299 laptop, is a silent economic shockwave. A strategy so subtle, so gradual, and so widely accepted, that most people don't even notice what's happening. Here's the uncomfortable mystery. How can one country sell products so cheap that entire industries in other nations collapse trying to compete? And more importantly, what is the real cost of paying less? Tonight we're going deep into how China's ultra-low prices didn't just disrupt Western economies, they quietly reshaped them, and the consequences are still unfolding. To understand the story, we need to step back not to 2010, not to the rise of Amazon, but to a world where the West made almost everything it consumed. Factories in the US, the UK, Germany, France, and Canada boomed. Unions were powerful. Manufacturing towns thrived. A middle-class lifestyle was possible on a single factory wage. Then, in the background, something enormous was brewing. China, salated, agrarian, and still recovering from decades of internal upheaval, began rethinking its future. Its leaders asked a simple but game-changing question: what if we became the world's factory? But this was no accident. This was no sudden opportunity. It was a deliberate, calculated, long-term national blueprint. A blueprint that would collide violently with Western economic models. In the next chapters, you'll see how a series of events, from trade agreements to currency engineering, from labor systems to global corporate greed, formed the perfect storm. A storm that would lead to the destruction of millions of Western manufacturing jobs, a dependency loop that's nearly impossible to escape, a price war the West could never win. But before the collapse, there was a beginning. Our story begins in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping announced China's reform and opening up. This moment changed everything. Factories that once belonged fully to the state began opening to foreign investors. China built industrial zones the size of small countries. Infrastructure exploded: highways, ports, rail, energy systems, and most importantly, China had labor, hundreds of millions of workers willing to work for wages Western companies couldn't even imagine. Western corporations saw a goldmine. Lower costs meant higher profits meant happier shareholders, and so began the great outsourcing migration. Nike moved production. Apple followed. Walmart built an entire empire on cheap Chinese goods. Every year, more industries followed: toys, electronics, furniture, steel, solar panels, appliances. By the 1990s, China was no longer a rising competitor. It was a global default factory. But this was just phase one, because at this point, cheap prices weren't a weapon, they were an invitation, a trap waiting to snap shut. Then came China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. This moment didn't just open doors, it blew them off the hinges. With tariffs falling and trade barriers collapsing, a flood of ultra-cheap Chinese products hit Western markets. The effect was immediate. American factories closed, European manufacturers downsized, small businesses shuttered. Entire towns were hollowed out, but the West embraced it, because consumers loved the lower prices. It didn't matter that local jobs were disappearing. It didn't matter that industries were becoming dependent on foreign production. It didn't matter that supply chains were concentrating in one country. Everyone from shoppers to CUOs thought the same thing: cheaper is better. But China wasn't just offering low prices, it was engineering them. Here's how. 1. Currency strategy. For years, China kept its currency artificially low relative to the dollar, making exports cheaper than they naturally should be. 2. State subsidies. Entire industries, steel, solar, batteries, electronics received massive government support, allowing prices far below global market rates. 3. Command economy coordination. China could direct resources, labor, and capital with precision no Western democracy could replicate. 4. Scale. Unmatched scale. One factory in Shenzhen could produce more smartphones in a month than an entire Western country produced in a year. While Western companies cut costs to compete, China lowered prices again. While Western factory wages rose, China increased automation and kept labor abundant. It was a treadmill Western nations couldn't outrun, and by the mid-2000s, the West had entered what economists call the irresistible trap of cheapness. By now, Western industries weren't just shrinking, they were dependent. Try buying a phone, a battery, a toaster, a drone, a computer chip, a solar panel, or even basic clothing, without touching a Chinese supply chain. It became nearly impossible. But dependency was only the first problem. The second was far worse. China didn't just want to be the factory. It wanted to be the dominant manufacturer for the most important technologies of the future. Electric vehicles, semiconductors, green energy, telecommunications, robotics, batteries, rare earth minerals, industrial machinery. This wasn't a price strategy anymore. It was a global power strategy. By offering unrealistically low prices, China achieved two objectives: kill foreign competitors, make the world reliant on its production. When Western solar panel companies complained about impossible pricing, China lowered prices again. When US steel mills collapsed, Chinese steel flooded global markets. When European textile companies failed, Chinese factories expanded. Entire industries were wiped out. Even if the West wanted to rebuild, it was already too late. Because after you destroy the competition with cheapness, you don't need to stay cheap forever. By the mid-2010s, the consequences were unavoidable. 1. Deindustrialization. Millions of jobs vanished in the US, UK, Australia, and Europe. 2. The hollowing out of the middle-class. Manufacturing once created stable middle-income careers. Now those jobs were replaced by low-wage service work. 3. Dependency risk. Countries realized they relied on a foreign power for medicine, electronics, energy equipment, household goods, infrastructure components, rare earth minerals, critical raw materials. The cheapness came with hidden costs: lower wages, weaker unions, dying local industries, fragile supply chains, inflation, vulnerability, geopolitical risk. But the worst fallout: 4. The loss of industrial know-how. Factories don't just produce products, they produce expertise. Once you lose the factory, you lose the skills. Once you lose the skills, you lose the ability to rebuild. And that's the point where the West finds itself today. Governments tried everything: tariffs on Chinese imports, incentives to rebuild factories, national industrial strategies, tax credits for reshoring, restrictions on Chinese acquisitions by American or by European mandates. But most of these efforts failed to make a dent, because every time the West tried to rebuild, China lowered prices again. When the US imposed tariffs on solar panels, China subsidized its domestic producers even more. When Europe tried to revive textile manufacturing, China dropped prices further. It became a price war with only one possible winner: the nation structured economically to withstand it. The West wasn't. Western companies needed profit. Western workers demanded fair wages. Western governments couldn't coordinate industry like a command economy. Western shareholders punished any company that didn't prioritize quarterly earnings. China could plan for 20 years ahead. Western corporations planned for the next 90 days. The result: the West kept losing. Today, the strategy has evolved. Prices remain low. But now China dominates entire sectors. China controls 80% of global solar panel production, 85% of rare earth processing, 60% of electric vehicle batteries, 50% plus of global steel production, 90% of global drone manufacturing, 70% of the world's phone assembly, the majority of fast fashion garment output. But the scariest part: even when China raises prices, the West still can't compete, because the West no longer has the factories, the workforce, the supply chains, or the economies of scale. Cheapness wasn't just a phase, it was a transformation. A reshaping of the global economic order. And every time you buy a $12 blender or a $5 t-shirt, you're seeing the result. This is not the first time cheap imports reshaped global power. Britain used cheap textiles to destroy India's cotton industry. The US used cheap mass-produced goods to dominate Latin American markets in the early 1900s. Japan used cheap electronics in the 1970s to dethrone Western brands. Cheapness is always a strategy. But China's version is different in one key way. It wasn't one industry, it wasn't one decade. It was everything, all at once, over 40 years. A level of economic coordination no nation in history has ever executed so effectively, and that's why the impact is so profound. 3 takeaways. 1. Cheapness is never free. Every low price has a hidden cost: jobs, factories, skills, independence. 2. Dependency is more dangerous than competition. The West didn't just lose industries, it lost the ability to rebuild them. 3. China didn't win through deception, it won through strategy. A long-term plan executed consistently, while the West chased short-term profits. If nothing changes, The future won't be a world where Western nations simply buy more Chinese goods. It will be a world where Western nations can only buy Chinese goods. A world where control of production becomes control of power, because the country that makes everything eventually controls everything. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, make sure you like the video so more people can understand what's really happening behind those cheap prices. Subscribe for more deep dives into global finance, economic history, and the forces reshaping the modern world. And in the comments, tell me, do you think the West can ever rebuild its manufacturing power, or is it already too late?